themes are tied together around the idea of responsibility, of opportunity, what it really means to be an American. We didn't rehearse these in advance, and so the fact that we're all talking about the same thing is pretty remarkable. As you know, I teach history here, and I am what I typically call myself, I'm an economic historian, meaning that if you want the answer to most historical questions, follow the money and you get it. That's generally the school that I go to. So whenever it comes to talking about what it means to be American, the American ideal, at the end of the day, we have to look at that issue. One of the most enduring icons of American identity is the notion that America is the land of opportunity, that anyone can succeed. Right? Anyone who works hard and takes responsibility for his or her life can thrive. This is a key ideal that originated with the colonial settlers and was certainly enshrined in the very founding of our nation. So let's look at this very quickly. For the most part, we come from European culture. And in Europe and in the world that the early Americans came from, status and importance was largely based on a person's family. Nobility is what mattered. You are important because of your family name. You are important because of the title that comes with being you. In other words, who you are is more important than what you do. Well, when the settlers came over to what would become the United States, none of them were particularly important. And as we know, certainly in Europe, they were peasants. They were nobodies, if you will, at least in the eyes of the nobility. And they rejected this concept outright. They did not like it. Most importantly, what they believe is that over here in the New World, over here in North America, over here where they would eventually form the United States, they can be anything that they want to be. And as we built our society over the decades, eventually we decided that we didn't want to be part of Britain anymore, and we declared independence, and our founding fathers put this in the very founding documents of our nation for a reason. Now, I tend to get a little bit sad when I hear of what students are often taught in high school, because one of the stereotypes of our nation's founding fathers is that they were a bunch of rich white men who were privileged and wrote an awful lot of good ideals into these documents, but themselves did not really live up to them, if you will. This is not necessarily true. Our founding fathers were a very diverse group. They were diverse economically, they were diverse in terms of their worldviews. They did not have one single mindset. So if our founding fathers were a bunch of rich white men who were really, not living up to the ideals that they were writing about, let's take a look at a few of them and see if that is really true. And of course, the first man we should look at is our good friend George. As a middle-aged man, George Washington was most definitely rich, and pretty sure he was white too. But if we think of George Washington as having come from privilege, I'm sorry to disappoint you. He really wasn't. George Washington was born into a successful Virginia family. They were not poor. They were better off than most, but they were certainly not wealthy. Here's what matters with George Washington, though. His father died when he was 11 years old. And from that point forward, he took 100% responsibility for his life. He took care of his own education. He got his first job. He acquired his land. He built his life. He built his life. He did not inherit any of the wealth that he would later have himself. George Washington was a self-made man. Let's go to the next slide. We know Ben, right? Another rich founding father, right? Ben Franklin was the son of a soap maker. Squarely from the working classes. His father, we don't know if his father was literate or not, but we know that education was not a priority in the Franklin household when he was young. He educated himself. And when he would go on to become a very successful man, it was effectively entirely because of what he did. He made his life what he wanted it to be. How about we move on to another one? How about Alex? We've all heard of him, right? First Secretary of the Treasury. Could very well have been president had he been able to dodge a bullet. Alexander Hamilton came here as a teenager from the Caribbean island of St. Croix. He was penniless, completely self-educated, a 100% self-made man. He was also an orphan. He had no family when he came here. Now, we've all heard of the big founding fathers, right? We've all heard of the ones that would become most prominent, but there's certainly others that we should look at as well, just to look at them. And I grabbed these guys basically at random. Let's go to the next one. How about Samuel Chase, signer of the Declaration of Independence? Samuel Chase was the son of a minister. His family was not privileged in any notable way. Now, his family did value education. They did teach him literacy and math and the typical subjects that a young man at that age would learn, but there was no wealth here. And he would go on to become a very successful man in his own right through his own work. How about we go to the next one? George Taylor. George Taylor was an indentured servant. He came over here from Europe at age 20. He, of course, had nothing. After his indentured servitude, he acquired a little bit of land and eventually would become one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. How about George Walton? George Walton was a carpenter. That's what he was. He was born into a working-class family. His father died. He was raised by his uncle who trained him to be a carpenter, and as a young man decided he'd rather practice law instead. So he taught himself how to practice law, eventually went into politics, and eventually became a founding father. Now, if you go down the list of the founders of our nations, you will find some that came from wealth. Again, they were a diverse group. Nobody would say that Thomas Jefferson was born into a poor family. However, most of them were not what we would consider wealthy. They just simply weren't. So when they sat down to create our nation, when they sat down to write the Declaration of Independence, but later, of course, more importantly, the Constitution, they weren't interested in creating a noble class. They were interested in creating a nation of self-made men. Today, we would say self-made people, of course. We think of them as privileged, and when you are wealthy, you are, but that was privilege that they earned. That was privilege that they made for themselves. And what really matters with this is that they wanted you to be. And when you look at our Constitution, that is exactly what we see written within it. Very importantly, titles of nobility are expressly prohibited. Every section of the Constitution, in one way or another, is designed to give opportunity to people so that they can build lives for themselves. And most importantly, and we see it certainly in the values that enabled these men to become successful, everyone should earn their own way in life. Everyone should take care of themselves. Everyone should say, if I want to become successful, if I want to become wealthy, who's going to have to do it? Let's raise our hands, right? That's exactly the case. You see, wealth has positives and wealth has negatives. It is certainly human nature for us to want to be successful like these men. And again, these men certainly wanted you to get there. These men would want you to make that happen. And of course, if you work hard, if you become successful, if you earn a good life for yourself, we all agree that you should get to enjoy that, right? It's a good thing. Here's the problem that our founding fathers saw, and here's the problem that they felt could end up happening over here. Another characteristic of earning that success is doing everything you can to make sure that your family hangs on to it. In other words, I want my children to be successful because of our family name rather than what they do. You see, it's one thing to become successful. Like, by the way, George Washington, if we go back, we have to go back to George. In today's dollars, George Washington was probably worth about $500 million. Just to let you know, he was worth probably about $500 million. What they feared would happen is that once we built up a wealthy merchant class, once we built up a wealthy planter class, once we built up a nation that was successful, we would then have wealthy Americans passing that wealth on to their children, and their children would not have to become self-made. Are you following me? You see, it's one thing to earn the wealth yourself. It's another thing to ensure that your children don't have to. And it is that second part that caused our founding fathers to be deeply concerned. Because, of course, if you inherit enough wealth to where you never have to earn it yourself, what does that make you? That makes you a nobleman. Exactly. That makes you nobility. So, what is our nation supposed to be? It is supposed to be a nation of self-made men. Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College is one of the best community colleges in the nation. That is statistically observable. I'm not just saying it because I like the school. I'm saying it because the data backs it up. We can talk about other prestigious schools. We can talk about Ivy League schools. We can talk about colleges with an excellent program in this, or an excellent law school, or an excellent med school. And we're often impressed. We're often impressed when we hear that so-and-so went to the #1 law school in the country, or the #1 whatever school in the country. And I always try to dial that back. And I always try to insist to my students that that is not what you're supposed to consider whenever you're applying to school. Because what's ultimately going to make you successful? Is it the school you go to, or is it what you do when you get there? Right? It's what you do when you get there. And so, when we think about the American ideal as it applies to us, when we think of the American ideal as it applies to the Founding Fathers and their visions for you, remind yourself, your success is going to be based on you being self-made. Thank you.